so important to the Christian life, why is this requirement not mentioned more often in the Bible, like baptism, for example? And why on 1 Corinthians 11:17 it appears to be more of a dinner to remember the Lord than a sacrifice? Again, that's from Gina.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. First of all, the criterion, if something is important, it would be mentioned many times in the Bible, I think is a false criterion. Like, I don't agree to the premise of the question. Let me see if I can think of an example. How important do you think it is not to cheat on your wife?
Pretty important.
It's pretty foundationally important, right? But you look through the New Testament, how many specific admonitions are there not to commit adultery? Couple, right? But
I see what you're saying.
It's just not a ton,
Yeah.
How important is it, regardless of how you conceive of the Eucharist, how important is it that we administer the Eucharist to women, specifically? I think most Christians would say, however important the Eucharist is, it's equally important for men and women, of course. And yet, how many times does the New Testament explicitly teach administer communion to women? 0.
Yeah.
Never says it. Here's another one that'll really kind of bake your noodle. All right. How important do you think it is to conceive of God as loving?
Wow.
Okay. How many times does Jesus say in the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke that God loves you? 0.
Wow.
Now that's going to bake everybody's noodle right there.
Yeah.
But it's true. Go look it up.
All right.
He doesn't say it. He says it a couple times in John. How about the book of Acts? How many times does Acts mention the love of God? Never. Not one time. Wait a minute, Anders. I thought the God of the New Testament was all goody-nicey and the Old Testament God was all baddie-meanie. Actually, the vast majority of discussions of God's love are found in the Old Testament.
Wow.
So the baddie-meanie, goody-nicey dichotomy is a false dichotomy. That's a misinterpretation of the Bible. I'm not saying the love of God's unimportant. What I'm doing is I'm saying your criterion for evaluating importance by simply counting up the number of biblical references is a false criterion. All right. Now, the communal meal aspect of the Eucharist, which is on display in Corinthians, is absolutely part of the Eucharist. And in fact, this is Catholic teaching, that the Eucharist is the sacrament of the Church's unity. The one expression of which is the virtue of conviviality. St. Thomas Aquinas says that affability, just like being a friendly sort to your fellows, is a necessary but not sufficient component of the virtue of justice, which is very essential. Justice is rendering to your fellow human being what is his due. And obviously there are weightier matters of justice, like not bearing false witness in a capital case and, not defrauding him of his livelihood. That's extremely important. But just having the common decency to say hello to him, right? It's not the whole of justice, but it's an integral part of it, right? Yeah. And so even that level of positive interaction is implied in the justice that is worked within our souls through Eucharistic fellowship, and the visible expression of that communion in the Church is part of the function of the Eucharist. One of the reasons we have sacraments, St. Thomas says, is so that we can have these visible, tangible points of unity that we can all come around and celebrate together as fellow Christians. St. Augustine once said, God gave us the Church so we would have people to do good to. So I don't want to in any way minimize the reality of the Eucharist as the sacrament of the Church's unity. As far as the sacrificial elements of the Eucharist are concerned, Paul makes this point quite explicitly when he discusses whether or not Christians can participate in the sacrifice to idols. And he says, you cannot be a partaker of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. And he's talking here, that language of table is like altar table of sacrifice. You can't participate in the sacrifice of Christ and the sacrifice of demons, he says. And so he teaches the sacrificial nature of the Eucharist through the analogy to pagan sacrifice, which he says is disallowed to Christians, because of their participation in the Eucharistic sacrifice. Now, let's carry through a little bit more with the idea of Christian sacrifice. St. Paul tells us that to offer our bodies a living sacrifice is what true worship consists in. Romans chapter 12. If you want to worship legitimately as a Christian, it is not fundamentally a matter of, say, your bodily posture, rituals, or gestures. It is a matter of offering your body, offering your life in service to others. Jesus says the Father doesn't look for worshipers, on this mountain or that mountain, but those that will worship him in spirit and in truth. That means the loving sacrifice of our lives, which sacrifice is figured for us in the offering of his body and blood in the Holy Eucharist. So that's why it's the source of some of the Church's life, because it is the sacrament that represents for us the passion and resurrection of Christ, to which we are to configure our lives.
Gina, thanks for your